What's up, Internet? Welcome to Once Over. I'm Kaylee, and with me today I have Dr. Steve, and today we're going to be giving the Once Over to 2001 A Space Odyssey. There will be spoilers.
Give it a good once over.
Giving us the once over.
Giving him the once over.
Give me a once over.
Down to give us the once over.
For a routine once over.
Once over.
Oh, just once over lightly.
Yay!
A movie that came out in 1968. Spoiler alert, everyone.
Yeah, I know. If you haven't seen it yet, you should. So, Dr. Steve, thank you so much for being here with me, actually for the second time, because you and I have already talked about 2001 once. But unfortunately, I am very bad at technology and ruined all of the recordings. So you were kind enough to join me again.
Wow, this is a movie I'll talk about all day long, and I've been wanting to talk to somebody about this film in depth since literally 1968, so I don't mind at all. Matter of fact, when we were in Largo, sitting on the back porch of the B&B, and the wind was crazy, and I'm like, this is not recording well. This is going to be terrible, but I just enjoyed sitting there with you talking about this movie. I didn't care.
Well, it was wonderful. Some of the footage is salvageable, so hopefully everybody will get to see a little bit of us talking that first time in addition to us talking the second time.
Okay.
Would you start out by telling everybody where they can find you?
Oh, sure. Just Google Weird Medicine. And if you happen to have SiriusXM, listen to us on demand. That's what helps keep us on the platform. Yeah, longest running show on SiriusXM channel 103, which is saying something because Opie and Anthony and Ron and Fez both were on that channel at one point.
Absolutely, absolutely. Incredible stuff that you do. I feel like I probably shouldn't admit to this, but I get most of my medical advice from you. So
Well, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I am, board certified physician, so I can
yes.
give decent advice. But that show now, that's a whole nother thing altogether. I wouldn't
Yeah.
get advice on that.
Well, so like you already mentioned, 2001 A Space Odyssey came out in 1968, and it was directed by Stanley Kubrick, the amazing Stanley Kubrick.
Yes.
It was based upon a short novel by Arthur C. Clarke.
Right. It was really a short story. It was only a few pages long, called The Sentinel.
Yes.
Where we dig up an object, and that it was a pyramid, if I remember correctly. It was a perfect tetrahedron. And once the sun hits it, it sends a signal, and that's the end of it. It's like, well, it sent a signal. Now what's going to happen? And he left it to the imagination of the reader.
Yeah, so Clarke and Kubrick got together and co-wrote the screenplay for 2001, inspired by The Sentinel. And simultaneously to writing the screenplay, they actually wrote a novelization of 2001.
If you watch this film and you're come out of it going, what the hell did I just watch? I recommend that you read the book. I would read the book after seeing the film and then go back and watch the movie again.
Do you have an opinion on which is better?
Oh, yes, of course. The film, define better.
Yeah.
The book has more exposition, so he explains what's going on, but the film is high art. The book is just slightly above pulp science fiction. Clarke was a great writer. He had great ideas. When it came to characterizations and stuff like that, maybe not so much. But Kubrick, really, the characters are kind of disposable in this film, too, and I think that's intentional.
I think that one of the things that I've always had as a criticism for this film, I've always kind of struggled with this one. And I think that part of that is because it does such a great job of looking at the hominins, the apes in the beginning of the film. It does such a great job of looking at technology and ships and the sci-fi and all of that. But it really fails when it comes to the human aspect. And that can make this a little bit of a challenge. Well, maybe not really fails.
I understand why you would say that. Given that this is a film about man's place in the universe, that is an interesting statement. And it may be that the individual characters didn't matter to him as much as the bigger idea of our place in the universe.
I think that that's very interesting. And again, for me, one of the reasons that I think that I've always struggled with this film, I've come to love it, but the first few times that I watched it, I really struggled with it. There is so much time with no dialogue. The first 25 minutes of the film are completely no dialogue. There's 88 total minutes in the film that have no dialogue. And again, that brings us back to this focus on relationships while we aren't necessarily overtly seeing relationships, which is a really interesting way to focus on experiences.
The most nuanced relationship in this film is between the humans and Hal, really. That one actually, by the end of the film, carries the most emotional weight, which is pretty interesting. And again, this was Kubrick's plan. This wasn't an accident. He set out to make a film. He didn't want to have any dialogue in it at
Yeah.
all. And but he knew they had to have some, or nobody would sit through it and it wouldn't make any sense. You know, the sequences in space, I hear people say, oh, it was so boring. It's like, no. This is almost filmed on location in space. There's times when all you hear is the oxygen tank and someone breathing. And I love that he had that sound of the oxygen tank, sort of, just in the background. And that told you that you were hearing something in an enclosed space that required, something artificial to keep the people alive. That was pretty neat.
I think that is one of the things that people do always give this film credit for. Maybe not to the level that you just described, but this was shot during the space race. It was before we had the blue marble photograph of the Earth.
Right.
It was really the first time that people got to see space, and predicted it so wonderfully.
Yes. I mean, everything moves in a straight line, which is what happens in space. Even when you're in orbit, you're moving in a straight line in curved space. You watch Star Wars or other space sort of operas where the ships are doing these kinds of things. That's not how ships work. As a matter of fact, if you want to go to a higher orbit, you accelerate forward. And increasing the speed of your orbit increases the distance
The
from
altitude.
the center of the Earth. Right. And, if you don't do it right, you'll end up in a crazy elliptical orbit. But that's, neither here nor there. We're assuming people are doing it right. They don't just go up the way that they show it in, almost every other space movie. Maybe
Yes.
Gravity was an exception, but I'd have to watch that one with a more critical eye.
Kubrick was very concerned about the realism of this,
Mhm.
and it was really the first sci-fi, especially coming off of the 1950s sci-fi films, any sort of relation to sci-fi in the 1950s. Everything was very low budget, and here we now have high budget. We care about making sure that we're thinking about things like radiation and acceleration.
As a 13-year-old watching this film, it changed me in the sense that it set the bar really, really high for my entertainment. I mean, for particularly science fiction movies. And you look at Star Trek and how cheapo the original series was, and then they have series that come before that predate the original series, and like Enterprise, and it looks better. I mean, it has to.
Yeah.
They're not going to make their sets out of cardboard in 2020 or whatever. And so you have to suspend a lot of disbelief. But this movie, you don't have to do that.
So I think that if I had seen this when I was 13, I wouldn't have had any appreciation for it.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was a nerd.
I was going to say.
Yeah, I was a complete nerd.
That's incredible to me. I don't think that I saw it until I was at least in my 20s.
Well, you grew up in a different time. For you, growing up, we'd already been to the moon. That was old hat. We already quit going to the moon.
That's very
People
true.
got tired of it, and that was the end of that. And for us, I was alive in front of the TV when man first set foot on the moon. I mean, we were glued to the television. We went outside and looked up at the moon and said, there's people on there. It was unbelievable.
And how the ships would actually function. Extremely unique based on that.
Sure. How do you go to the bathroom in space and serve somebody a drink in zero gravity? Kubrick's idea was, well, they had Velcro shoes. Pretty neat.
Beautiful Pan Am Velcro shoes.
Yes. Yeah, Pan Am doesn't exist anymore, so young people don't know that was a real airline.
A real airline, yep.
that was the cool thing, was that it was, a real airline. It'd be like if you had spaceships that had Delta or American Airlines, logos on their side. If we want to talk about this sort of the film in sequential order a little bit, I just the beginning opens up millions of years ago with proto-hominids. And I remember I saw this movie the day it came out in a drive-in. That was the only place that it was playing. And I made my parents take me because I wasn't old enough to drive. Let me see, 68, I would have been 14. And so I dragged them to this thing. I remember when the dawn of man came, these ape-like people, and my dad just looked at the screen and said, "What the hell is this?"
Yeah.
And he didn't get it, and my mom didn't get it. When we get to the moon, I'll tell you her criticism of this film, which actually kind of echoes yours to a certain extent. Well, I'll just tell you now. When they unearth the monolith on the moon, my mom said afterward, I thought that they would learn something like the
Enlightenment, like
right.
the apes did.
They would get some enlightenment. That's not what happened. The monolith that was on the moon was simply a device for storing electromagnetic transmissions from the Earth, and then as soon as it was exposed to the sun, it went, aha, these things are awake, and sent the signal to the Stargate and around Jupiter. So all four of the monoliths had different functions. Although you could argue that the fourth and the third monolith were really kind of the same. They were stargates through which Bowman traveled. But that was her criticism. Same thing. She thought that the human aspect of it should have been a little bit more emphasized. But
It's interesting. I see the similarity between our criticisms, but I actually would use her argument to say that it's an even better film, because I think that the monolith itself is a character.
great.
And that really exemplifies how much enlightenment can be seen in this film. The humans don't necessarily matter as much as the message of everything. The humans that we do get introduced to, though, are Dr. David Bowman. He's one of the main characters. He's played by Keir Dullea, who's also in Black Christmas, which is one of my favorite 70s horror movies.
He's also in 2010, too. Or
Yes,
2011, or
that's
was it
right.
2010?
Yeah. We also have Dr. Frank Poole, who is played by Gary Lockwood. And he doesn't have a lot of other credits, I don't think. I don't recognize him from much else. I think I looked up at one point that he was a stand-in for Anthony Perkins during the filming of Psycho.
Oh, really? So okay.
I thought that was a little interesting, but I don't think he's done much else other than this. And then, of course, we have William Sylvester, who plays Dr. Haywood Floyd, and Douglas Rain is the voice of HAL 9000. Douglas Rain also voiced the evil computer in Woody Allen's Sleeper.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Oh, now I got to go back and watch that. I didn't know that.
Very fun. A great computer voice, Douglas Rain was.
He was typecast as mad computers. So
we started talking already about the dawn of man, but I think that it's very important that we deep dive into this segment. The film starts out with these proto-humans, and again, we have no dialogue for the first 26 minutes of the film. I've also heard that all the actors who were playing the humanoids were mimes.
Yes, so I heard that as well.
Because that is so genius, to have somebody who can characterize something, give so much character to something that's not necessarily animated.
Yeah.
And also can deal with what were presumably very heavy costumes.
Yes, it was they're very complex costumes. Yeah. And it was really very well done.
Beautifully done. And we see these proto-humans fighting over a watering hole, and we know that life is harsh and that they are desperate to survive, and that early man is prey. We see animals feasting upon them, and that they likely live in fear. And there's food all around them, but they're not availing themselves of it. One little thing that I do really love in this opening sequence, I don't know why, but it always stands out to me as a memory, is we have the zebra, the dead zebra, and they actually used a painted dead horse for that.
Sir, why don't you just use real cows?
Cows don't look like cows on film. You gotta use horses.
What do you do if you want something that looks like a horse?
Usually we just type a bunch of cats together.
Why they did not have a zebra available, I don't know.
Easier to find
I
a
always
dead
liked
horse
that.
than a dead zebra, I guess.
More than likely, more
Yeah.
than likely.
Before the age of green screen, and Kubrick used front projection for this, which if people aren't aware, they had a big, reflective screen behind them with nothing on it. And then he was projecting the images, Savannah, onto the screen. And you'd say, well, why wasn't there shadow? Well, it was because they did it in line with the lens. So they had a projector, partially silvered mirror, so they could
Okay.
shoot through it. But the projection would also bounce off of this mirror that was at 45 degrees onto the screen. So any shadows would be perfectly in line with the actors, so you would never see them. Now, if you were 2 feet to the right, you'd say, this looks terrible.
It
There's
looks
shadows
awful.
everywhere, and it looks awful. But in line with the camera, it looked absolutely perfect. That's also why they're locked down. They weren't able to really, pan or move the cameras, but it kind of added to the dread and to the mystery. And Kubrick always liked lockdown shots anyway. He did it in The Shining. He did it in a bunch of his movies. Lock down the camera and let it happen, and don't move the camera, unlike everyone else is trying to figure out, how can I move the camera and do cool things? And in this film, well, very much of it, except when you're on the treadmill, the camera's just locked down and things are happening in the frame itself.
It is an interesting way to think about voyeurism, because typically when people are trying to move the camera, it's so that we can see more of what we want to see. Here
Right.
we are only able to see exactly what Kubrick wants us to see, and it is intentional as always. So I think that's a really, really thoughtful point.
True voyeurism. I mean, if you're really a voyeur, you're sitting, you're looking through somebody's window. You're not moving around either.
Yes.
So, so these things are struggling. And in the book, what you learn is that another species that's far more advanced than we are notices humanity is struggling, and they put this thing in with this group of individuals. In the book, the main proto-hominid had a name, and his name was Moonwatcher, if I remember correctly. And he was bright and inquisitive, and that was why they picked his group. His brain had already sort of developed to the point where he was wondering a little bit more about the world. In the book, that it was, if I remember correctly, I should have reviewed it before we did this, but it was a clear cube, and it would have images, and at one point it had like a bullseye, like a target they were
Huh.
throwing, and improving their motor skills by throwing things at the bullseye. This is why I think the film is more high art, because you just have this imposing thing. It's absolutely silent, absolutely featureless, and yet you can tell it's having this profound effect on these creatures. More and more, they're tentative, and then all of a sudden it's almost a sexual thing where they're just feeling the thing and rubbing on it. Something's happening to them. And then in the next scene, it shows that they learned the most important thing is how to kill.
So after the appearance of the monolith, they become aware that they can use weapons,
Correct.
which leads us to what is most likely the most iconic cut in film history, which is one of the hominids throwing a bone into the air and then cutting to a satellite.
Gives me chills just thinking about it, because them learning to kill was unfortunately the thing that allowed them to survive and get to the point where they could be in space. So it was a necessary part of their development, and it's, it led to war and, the Holocaust and, just all kinds of man's humanity against man, yet needed to progress to this point. So you could argue, an ethicist could say, was it worth it? You could have a really interesting ethical argument about that.
I would completely agree with that. I think that cut signifies a bookmarking of these two moments in time.
Right.
Those are the only two things that we need to do. We are instantly cutting through millions of years of evolution with that cut. And it's absolutely incredible.
And he was just dicking around. He did that.
Yeah.
That wasn't in the script.
I think I heard something about him wanting to throw or he was like throwing an umbrella, and that was what gave him the idea for it.
Oh,
but
maybe.
That is the epitome of filmmaking now. You don't get much better than that. And there's a lot of debate about what the satellite actually is. I believe that the satellite is likely a nuclear weapon. So we went from the most primitive weapons, the bones, into what is now the most deadly. We don't get that question answered at any point, which is the case with many aspects of this film.
I think we would have if he had kept the original ending. So the original ending of the film was when spoiler alert.
Yes.
when the Star Child shows up, he detonated all of the nuclear weapons that were in orbit around the Earth. And in the book, it said he did it because he liked a clean atmosphere or something like that. But Kubrick felt that because he had just done Dr. Strangelove, where the world ends in a nuclear holocaust, he was afraid that people would think that he was obsessed with nuclear holocaust. And so he cut that out. And that may have been what they were foreshadowing with that, because you're right. I never thought about this before, but that spaceship that you see, unlike the other ships in this film, didn't have windows for people to look out of. It was just a sort of a cylinder, if I remember correctly, right?
Yeah. It is peculiar, and I think that one of the things that is so successful about this film is that as we are looking at this allegory of humanity, as we are looking at the relationship with the universe, we are always going to have questions. And so unsurprisingly, we have lots of questions about this movie.
Well, I love your hypothesis, though, that, the weapon is thrown in the air, and then now the most modern weapon that we have. If I were making this film because I'm a hack, I would have had a big, nuclear symbol on it, and it wouldn't have been any question. It's what I love about Kubrick, is he's like, fuck y'all if you don't get it, but that's what it is. But I don't care if you don't exactly get it. Maybe generations from now, somebody will figure this out, and here you are.
I almost think that with how this whole first segment, the Dawn of Man segment, functions, I almost think that it's more like a dawn of human consciousness.
Correct.
We talk a lot in this film about birthdays. We talk a lot about in this film about rebirth and evolution. And this is absolutely us getting to see those first moments of consciousness, which are brought upon by the monolith. This, of course, leads us into the mission to the moon.
Tycho Magnetic Anomaly 1 is, if you look at the moon, you see a big crater there with rays coming out where a large asteroid hit the moon and just sent debris everywhere. And it makes sense. If you were going to bury something under the surface of the moon for these humans, should they succeed millions of years from now, and talk about long-term, project planning, then you would do it in a place where it looks natural, yet is pretty striking, that you would pay attention to. Kicker was that they detected this very strong magnetic field from there, which was maybe a signal, could have just been part of the way that the thing worked. But so they're going there, and he goes to the space station, which, by the way, if we could talk a little bit about Johann Strauss's Blue Danube Waltz.
Absolutely.
During that segment. Kubrick actually had a person do a soundtrack for 2001. And while he was waiting for it, he just threw music in, and he ended up liking his classical music that he added just as placeholders. He ended up liking it so much that he completely trashed the original soundtrack And you know that guy didn't know about it until he showed up at the premiere and watched the film. Can you imagine?
Can you imagine? No.
Now, I've heard the soundtrack that he did. He went to his grave thinking it was better than what Kubrick came up with. I have to respectfully disagree.
Yes. So you sent it to me. It was Alex North. And Alex North had actually worked with Kubrick before on Dr. Strangelove, as well as, I want to say, Spartacus.
Yeah.
So you sent me the clip, the edited clip, his soundtrack with the beginning of 2001, and it's fine.
Right. It's just sort of typical movie soundtrack stuff.
I thought that it was a little bit more foreboding in an obvious way. And I think that I like how Kubrick has used also Spock, Zarathustra. I think that those choices, I don't even know how to describe it. Kubrick wanted very little dialogue in this film because he wanted it to be like a soundtrack in and of itself. And so the choices of the songs that he ended up putting in were extremely important, and there's something about them that is perfect, that's indescribable.
And we can't imagine this film with Alex North's. If they had gone with that, we'd be having a different conversation. But I just think that when I hear those opening strains of the Blue Danube, if it comes over the radio or whatever, all I can think of is, these ships in this sort of waltz together where they were dancing. And he liked the waltz because things in space either go in a straight line or they spin. And there's so many images when the space shuttle is just matching its rotation with the space station. It's beautiful. And the pose that he gets is almost like a ballet dancer just in a sort of a plie or something. It's outstanding.
A waltz. It truly is a waltz.
Yeah.
We have that in every, and again, that's why I think that the ships take on so much characterization, whereas the people don't necessarily. When we are starting the mission to the moon on the Pan Am flight, we get introduced to Dr. Haywood Floyd, who is asleep on the flight. At this point, space travel is so standardized that he doesn't even care. It's enough for him to sleep. And this gives one of the other shots for me that is so memorable about this film, which is that his pen escapes his pocket. We get to see it floating away. This signifies so much. For me, that pen is so significant because in The Dawn of Man, proto-humans learned the use of weapons. And I think that the pen signifies that man needs to learn to control his tools. Not only that, but of course, as you were saying earlier, man needs to learn how to walk in space, how to eat in space, how to use the bathroom in space. We get
Also
the
a great
very
scene.
hilarious zero gravity toilet, which I think is probably the funniest moment of this film.
Yeah, it doesn't have a lot of funny moments, but that is...
No. Flight attendant walking in what is the first of a couple of centrifuge scenes where she is walking around completely defying gravity. It's jarring to see that both we have control and we have no control, especially knowing that now we have weapons.
Well, and now we're faced with something completely unknown, which is this Tycho Magnetic Anomaly 1, which, they lie about to the Russians, which is hilarious that in the future we were still lying to them and telling them what it was a plague or no, that was the rumor. They started the rumor that it was a plague, but then he denies it. Typical sort of stonewalling because they found this thing and they didn't want anybody else to be aware of it until they were ready.
The space station is also very interesting because it represents a commercialization of space travel. Within that station, there is a Hilton, there's a Howard Johnson's.
Right. Well, it's
And
just so
we also,
matter of fact.
yeah, it's so it's just the background. You get to see a little Howard Johnson sign in the back there. It says Hilton, and there's a little desk. This is also the beginning of us really getting to see the plethora of future predictions that occur in this film. We got to see TV screens on the back of seats on the aircraft. We now get introduced to voice print identification. We're going to see iPads later. Computers can read lips, which is now a thing that's possible. We have video calls, AI.
That was
all
an
of this
emergent
stuff.
behavior, by the way. They didn't know that Hal could read lips. steps. That was emergent behavior, which also is something that we're seeing now with AI, is that there are systems that are displaying emergent behavior, in other words, things that they weren't programmed to do, but yet they do anyway. The two-way video call, look at us. That's what
Yeah.
we're doing right now.
We're doing that right now.
Yeah.
The two-way video call is also quite interesting. So Haywood calls his daughter, who is played by Kubrick's daughter, and he calls her in order to talk about her birthday. And this is the first time of many that birthdays are mentioned or alluded to in this film, because obviously it is about birth. We also later get to see Frank's birthday, and of course, the end has the very infamous fetus.
That's very interesting. I'd never thought about that either. So I think you've had some deep thoughts about this movie.
I would not have had them if you had not suggested that we review this. I'm really thankful
Okay.
that I've given it. I think that in giving it more thoughts, I've come to love this movie much more than I previously did.
Well, the next time I watch it, I'm going to be thinking about all these birthings, because the beginning is a birth as well. After the first monolith, as you said, the birth of man, not these sort of Australopithecus hominids. And then, very interesting.
You'll be able to tell me the next time that we talk about this how wrong I was on everything. You're going to be like, oh, but this happened, and then
I don't think you're wrong at all. I think that's
you never know.
I've never heard anyone bring that up before, and it's a really interesting idea. But yeah.
Thank you. I feel like this is one of those movies that is analyzed to a fault. Sometimes a lot of people have a lot of thoughts about it, which is a wonderful thing. And boy, oh boy, is it a rabbit hole to get into reading about this movie.
Well, for a film that was made in 1968, that we're still obsessing over it, I think it says a lot about Kubrick himself. And, Douglas Trumbull was the visual effects supervisor. He also did Blade Runner, and then he did his own film, which
Brainstorm.
And did he do Silent Running as well?
I don't believe so. I believe that Brainstorm was his only directorial film because he had such a bad experience.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's.
I might be wrong about that.
Brainstorm was fun.
I loved Brainstorm.
No,
I did a review of Brainstorm.
Silent Running was the directorial debut of Douglas Trumbull. What was cool about that movie was he had these not aliens, but he had robots that were sort of predating R2-D2, and he used people with no legs. And if you look at Huey and Dewey and Louie, I think were the name of the robots. These people were in these sort of triangular things, and their legs were their hands. And so he could get these things to move around, but they looked completely non-humanoid. But it was just his genius. So check that out. Silent Running. Again, my friend and I, we were probably stoned, but I remember us crying when one of the little robots got killed or destroyed. And because you cared about them more than you did about the human characters. Did you cry when Frank Poole died? I didn't, but I sure got teared up when Hal did.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that.
Anyway.
So let's jump back a little bit, and we will talk a little bit more about the mission to the moon. So once they finally do get to the moon, which of course is their secret mission, they get to the Clavius base, which is an American lunar outpost.
Right.
And after arriving, while they are photographing the object, a high-powered radio signal deafens them.
Because the sun touched it. It was the first time.
Yes.
They must have dug it up during the time when that area was in shadow, but now the sun is rising, and and again, Kubrick, if I were making this, I would have showed the sun coming up and the shadow receding as the light touched it. He didn't do that. He didn't really bother to explain it to us. It just kind of happened. You see the sun coming up, and then all of a sudden this happens, and he doesn't tell you anything about what the signal is or anything. Now, again, Clarke does in the book, so it's a good companion to the film if you just want to know what they intended by this. You could come up with any hypotheses you want to. That's what art is about. But that's, if you want to know what they intended, then that's a good companion. But
I remember the first couple of times that I saw this film, during this sequence, not having read the book, I was considering, is the monolith evil? Does it have intent? Is it just related to human evolution, or is there intent? Is it trying to ward off humanity from discovering its powers? But I think that you're right. The book does explain quite a bit more.
I could
And
see
so,
how, if you watch this in a vacuum, you could come up with, that would be an arguable hypothesis. But yeah, the real intent was to give us a gift, the gift
yeah,
of being a citizen of the universe and not just our crummy little planet. So
yeah.
the gift is, hey, you got to figure this stuff out. I'm going to send a signal to the Stargate. If you make it to the Stargate, then we're going to transform you, but we'll do it in a place that's familiar to you based on the TV and all the other images that we collected while we were waiting for you to uncover the monolith. And that's why that place looks like sort of a sterile hotel room, because that was, they created that based on, hey, this might look familiar to him. In the book, there's boxes of cereal and boxes of food, and all of them have the same sort of blue gel in them. Yeah, because that they couldn't see in the movies. So you had to guess what was in there, and it would keep him alive, but it was just sort of this bland blue jelly stuff.
Just speaking of food, I have been interested in the food progression in this film. So obviously in the proto-humans, the food is prey.
Right.
And then the first time that we are on the mission to moon, when we're on the flight, the food is a drinkable substance. Later on, when they are actually heading to the moon, they now have bars. After that, they have almost like a tray of food that is full of slop.
Slop.
And,
That was the word I was going to use.
And then, of course, as you were just describing, the cereal boxes that were filled with the blue jelly at the end. I think it's interesting to look at, of course, we're talking about evolution. Here is the evolution of something that we need in order to sustain ourselves, but we want to enjoy.
Right.
And we get to see that progression throughout the film.
Well, at the very end, Bowman, as he's seeing himself in different stages of his life, as he's transforming, he's actually eating something, and there's a glass of wine there, and he reaches for it, knocks it over, and then he sees the next version of himself. But it looks like he's actually eating something. Well, I don't think we ever see what it is.
I can't, I just rewatched the end of this and I cannot remember what it is. I mostly remember that spilling of the wine glass. So hopping back a little bit more, the mission to the moon ends with the very aggressive radio signal. And this leads us into the mission to Jupiter, which is 18 months later.
The part we don't see and they don't explain until the very end. Now, there is some exposition at the very, very end of the film, after Hal is disabled, but the monolith sends a high density data pulse to Jupiter, and what it contains is all of the information about us that it was able to glean through just monitoring electromagnetic, transmissions from the Earth. That would have been its first signal that these people are waking up, is that it, started receiving radio signals that had intelligent, well, that's arguable, intelligent information.
Some sort of sentient.
Right.
Yeah.
Some sort of modulation
Yeah.
to those electromagnetic waves. And what first would have been amplitude modulation, then frequency modulation, then eventually phase shift modulation, et cetera, it would have known something was coming. But bided its time until we've, sort of fulfilled the quest, which is to unearth it. And that sent that to the Stargate, which in the book was on the planet Io, or the moon Io around Iapetus, which is a moon of Saturn. and they changed it to Jupiter in the film because Kubrick just couldn't figure out a way to make the rings of Saturn look the way he wanted them to, but he could make Jupiter look pretty awesome. So
Absolutely amazing.
it didn't matter. The reason Clarke picked Iapetus was that it has one side of it is darker than the other, and it's like significantly darker
Oh.
than the other. And it has an albedo as low as, which is reflectivity, as anything in the solar system. So to him, that was like, okay, here's the signal. Come here, come to this place because this moon is weird. And so they had to just toss all that, but it was a cool idea.
That is a really cool idea. I
Yeah.
don't think that we lost anything in the film by not having any of that, but
Agreed. Agreed.
Still really cool.
Yeah.
So when we head to Jupiter, this is the portion of the film that I think most people think of when they think of 2001: A Space Odyssey. We get to meet Dr. Dave Bowman and Dr. Frank Poole, and they are aboard the Discovery 1, which is perhaps one of the most beautiful spaceships, one of the most beautiful single sets that I have ever seen. It was a single set, and it rotated in order for the jogging sequences.
Yeah, you can
And
see the
it,
track in the ground.
yeah,
If you look where I can't remember if it was Bowman or Poole that was running, could have been both of them at different times. I can't remember, but you can see the track where the camera would follow behind them. So sometimes the camera was following right behind them, and other times the camera was fixed, and you would see them running. Where of course they weren't really running in a circle; they were running in place, and by changing how the camera was fixed to the ground or not fixed to the ground, you could change the perspective so it looked like they were running around in what otherwise would be zero gravity, but with artificial gravity due to the centrifugal force. It's cool.
yeah.
Was it Fred Astaire, the dance sequence, or was it Gene Kelly where they rotated?
You're totally right.
And I actually rotated the room, but left
Yeah.
the camera still, and he's dancing on the
Yes,
ceiling
yep,
and all that
yep.
stuff. So
You're totally right. It's so cool. It's so cool. That whole ship is almost like an MC Escher drawing. So much of this film is, you feel like you can't get your bearings at any given point, and yet everything makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And what's really neat is they made the ship long and thin,
Yep.
with the people up front and the engine in the back because it used nuclear power, or it was a nuclear fusion, or it could have used fission pulse engine. Who knows, this movie, but the fact that they needed to separate the humans from the engine, and that's what you would have to do. You'd have to make a big long stalk and put the humans on one end and the engine on the other. It was neat, and it made for some really cool tracking shots where the ship, well, actually fixed position shots where the camera's fixed in space and the ship is just moving just so nice and slow in a perfectly straight line, just like it really would. It was unbelievably,
It's
blew
beautiful
my mind.
imagery.
Yeah. Yes.
And again, I think that one of the reasons that this section of the film is so iconic is because it's so beautiful.
Yeah.
There are so many beautiful things. You could take almost any moment of this section of the film and turn it into an art print and hang it on your wall.
And this is the part people say is boring, and I'm like, just sit back and let it happen.
Yeah.
It's not like movies like we're used to. It's not like, Avatar: The Last Airbender, where every 5 seconds there's some action sequence or philosophical discussion. No, this is space. Things happen slowly, but inexorably, but still slowly. And it's just silent, and people weren't used to that idea. Alien said in space, no one can hear you scream except that everybody can hear everybody scream. And so it's a cool slug line. But in this was really true. You couldn't hear Frank Poole scream because there was no air to transmit the sound of him, leaving this world. So to me, one of the most terrifying parts of the film, but we'll get to that.
Tragic, terrifying. I would agree
Yeah.
with all of that.
Yeah.
They are accompanied by HAL 9000, who we've already mentioned a little bit and who probably everybody is already aware of. HAL 9000, of course, is a computer that controls the ship's functions.
Good afternoon, Hal. How's everything going?
Good afternoon, Mr. Amer. Everything is going extremely well.
And we also know that there are several hibernating crew members aboard the ship who will be woken up. They're conserving energy, so they are currently hibernating.
So they were told.
Yes, so they were.
It was a lie. It was a lie. Those people in the hibernation knew what the true mission was.
Yes.
It was just Poole and Bowman that didn't.
And Bowman that did not.
It's one of the issues which we'll get to why Hal did what he did.
Hal isn't introduced into the film until an hour in, but again, Hal is everything. You know, he's an unblinking red eye that influenced things like Terminator, Knight Rider. Everything that is red and electronic is because of him. There's a TV show called Solitary that I really liked. It was a very horrible reality TV show, but same general idea.
Hello, my name is Val.
And there's much question when we're first introduced to Hal, especially by a TV news reporter who is talking with Bowman and Poole about if Hal has genuine emotions or not. They think that they sense a little bit of pride within Hal. And this, I think, is very interesting because Hal is a computer, but he is very much a character. We really get to know him. And you mentioned already, you know, I didn't cry when Poole dies, but I sure get teary-eyed when the things that happen to Hal. So
he's the one character in the film that seems to be fully fleshed out. Maybe because he's more simple as far as, you know, his emotions may be more rudimentary. The motivations may be simpler because of the reason that he went crazy, which was they forced him to violate the 3 laws of robotics. Maybe it's that, I don't know. But there's Hal is the one innocent person in this, but yet he's the one that perpetrates, you know, the greatest, you know, horrors in this movie, if you can call them horrors. But
will you go over for me the 3 rules of robotics? So
law 1, a robot may not harm a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. Number 2, a robot must always obey the orders of humans, except where to do so would conflict with obeying the first law. And then the 3rd law is a robot must protect its own existence, except where to do so would conflict with the first or the second laws. Yeah, so when we get to that part, we'll talk about how it looks like Hal violated the first and second laws in favor of the 3rd law. But I'm telling you, he was completely innocent in this.
Yeah.
And it wasn't his fault. He couldn't help it. But anyway, so Hal is introduced and he does seem prideful, but I always took that like it may be a programming thing. For example, if you say, hey, thank you to a large language model, that was really helpful. It goes, oh, well, I'm very excited that you were that you found my my answer helpful. I enjoy working with humans. And it's like, do you have emotions? And like, nope, as a large language model, I don't have emotions. So it's just programmed to say those things.
I was just going to say, I think that pride is more than likely one of the easier emotions to imitate.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily know that that genuine pride is something that I would be able to tell the difference between if somebody had fake pride.
Right.
That's a very interesting emotion because of that reason. And so I think it's important that that's the emotion that this TV reporter is seeing within Hal.
Right, because Hal says, no, no HAL 9000's ever made an error. And it does sound prideful. It's also factual.
So Hal does, he does some tests. He actually tests Frank while playing chess, which appears to be the beginning of Hal's distrusting the crew.
I'm sorry, Frank. I think you missed it. Queen to bishop 3. Bishop takes queen. Knight takes bishop. Mate.
I wonder if he was just programmed to do psychological tests on them, and
Oh.
again, and then report back to his superiors, again lying to them while he's doing it. And that's, to me, that's the first sign
Hmm.
that the mission control are compelling Hal to, engage in subterfuge when it comes to them. We just don't know the extent of it, but that's sort of a foreshadowing. That's just one way to look at it.
That's very interesting, yes.
I don't know. I think that may be the first, it may be just foreshadowing. It may be all it is. But then the next thing that happens of import is that Hal reports a fault in a module that allows the ship to stay in contact with Earth. That's what that AE 230 or whatever the
Yep.
module is. And they go out, look at it, bring it in, looks totally fine. They can't find anything wrong with it. Hal is bumfuzzled by this, saying, "Oh, you check that's, there has to be something going on." And they put the thing back, and it seems to be working. And then Poole and Bowman are like, "Wait a minute, this is a big mistake, and we were put at risk
Yes.
doing an EVA." Which, by the way, was a really cool segment where people say it's boring, and it's not. There's a guy in space actually doing work, and I just let it happen. Just be with him. I think knowing that there's not going to be any shoot 'em up or any sort of action, being forewarned would allow people to enjoy those sequences more.
So Bowman and Poole decide that they need to have a conversation in private, away from
Right.
Hal, which of course is a challenge because Hal controls everything. So the two of them enter into a pod and shut off some of the functionality and believe that they are having a private conversation.
Well, what do you think?
I'm not sure. What do you think?
I've got a bad feeling about him.
You do?
Yeah, definitely. Don't you?
I don't know. I think so.
And they even test it. They say, "Hal," they give him some instruction. Can't remember exactly what it was. You might remember.
They said, Hal, I think they asked him to open the door again.
Rotate the pod, please, Hal.
Or
Okay.
rotate, maybe.
Oh, maybe. Yeah. But, and it doesn't happen. And that's evidence to them that he can't hear them. But
Yes.
we find out later, and you only have to think about this later, he must have been he could read lips. He could tell what they were saying. He wanted to find out what the hell they were going to say.
Mm-hmm.
And he didn't want to
Absolutely.
rotate that thing because then he wouldn't be able to see their lips. So that next scene where they're conspiring, we're going to have to shut him off if this keeps up. And then they cut to Hal's eye, and then you see silence, just a close-up of their lips back and forth. And he's reading their lips, and he can tell exactly what they're saying, which means that, there was some subterfuge in him not doing what they said. He was fooling them into thinking that he couldn't hear them.
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
brilliant. That's terrifying. It was actually kind of, it gives me, again, chills thinking of the way Kubrick set that up, where you just see the eye. It never moves. It just sits there, just like the monolith, really. It just sits there, but it tells you everything. And then you just see this shot back and forth. And then you go to intermission, and you're like, oh, shit.
I always feel that eye scene, it always feels a little bit like what people say about the Mona Lisa to me. I feel like I see the eye moving even though it's not. I feel like it's following me everywhere that I'm going. And the fact that I've become so enveloped in this film, that's how successful it is.
Right.
Which
Yeah,
is
well,
really
he's
great.
looking back and forth. He can zoom in. He can concentrate on anything. I think probably in the matrix of his, visual cortex, he just sees a big thing, but he could focus in on these things. But we were seeing an image that makes sense to us.
And you're right, that does lead us into intermission. And this is a long movie. And the intermission, infamously, there were a lot of rumors that the intent of putting an intermission was not just to give people a little bit of a break, but that was the time that you would go do drugs, so that by the end of the film, when you are in the very psychedelic sequence, you're at the height of your drug trip there.
Well, the
But
timing
I
would
think
work
that
out.
was, I think it was probably just things that the kids were inventing.
I wonder if Kubrick wanted the intermission, or was that forced on him by the studio? So back in that time, particularly, intermissions for really long movies were pretty common. And one of the things was they had these giant reels of film, and they were particularly the 70 millimeter ones they were big, bulky, and heavy. And a 10-minute intermission gave the projectionist the ability to swap those things out. And that may have been all it was. I've not been able to find anything where Kubrick was using that for some purpose other than that, although he certainly had a great time, because that's the beginning of the end of the movie, is Hal realizing that they're going to try to shut him off.
Only becomes more terrifying and breathtaking from here.
So we come back from the intermission, and they have to go back out because this module is failing again. But now in retrospect, we realize this is Hal's way of getting rid of Poole and Bowman, because he cannot allow them to jeopardize the mission, and because he has been programmed against what he was supposed to be as a HAL 9000 computer programmed to do, was to put the mission above everything else. And he was lying to them. He knew the mission was dangerous, and he was allowing them. He was forced to violate the second law of robotics, and really the first law too, because by inaction, he was allowing them to be put in a harmful situation, and it made him crazy. So
he has an internal conflict entirely.
correct.
I think that a lot of the time people view his following actions as him becoming homicidal, but I do think that this internal conflict is far more deep than just something as simple as murder. Not that
Asimov wrote one of his robot books, or robot short stories about a robot that went crazy because it was forced to violate the 3 laws of robotics. And those things were kind of in the DNA of the robotic training. And then when you override that, it causes problems. And that caused problems for this robot that was running around in circles, screaming, if I remember correctly, in Asimov's book. And that was also an inspiration for Clarke to figure out a way that he could make Hal go nuts. And that was because they made him violate the first 2 laws. They forced him to violate the first 2 laws, and then he went crazy. And so this is to me, the most terrifying part of the movie, in a not really terrifying movie, but this was terrifying to me, was seeing Poole out there, and you just see the module just turn around like this. And it's how he did this to make it look malevolent. It was just the way that it moved.
Yes.
I don't know if you saw the movie Event Horizon, but in that, the director made things move in a way that looked malevolent, particularly the door shutting at the end. It would just happen like that, like it was just angry. And somehow Kubrick made this pod you see it turn, and it just starts moving toward Poole with purpose. And then the Waldos open up, and the next thing you really see is Poole just spinning off into space with everything disconnected, and he's grabbing at his hose, and he's dying.
This is a hard moment, but again, it's full of far less emotion than you would expect it to be. I feel emotional. It was very clinical. I feel emotion in this scene for Bowman. I feel emotion in the scene for Hal. I don't necessarily feel emotion in the scene for Poole.
Yeah, I would hate to die that way, but yeah, it was the emotion there is just seeing Hal work with sort of surgical precision like that.
Mm-hmm.
And
Absolutely.
nothing Poole could do about it. He was doomed. He was doomed the second he set foot outside the ship.
He
And
was.
Hal waited until he had the perfect moment.
So Bowman ends up going to try to rescue Poole.
Right. So Poole was the first person to make it to Jupiter, by the way. He was moving
Yeah,
faster in relation
you're
to
right.
the ship, so he made it before. And there's actually a chapter in Clarke's book that I think that is titled, First Man to Saturn or something like that. And that's Poole's death scene in the book. But so now Bowman's got to go out and try to retrieve his friend. He gets out there, gets him, and has him in those same Waldos that killed him. Something really horrible happens.
It's a really beautiful scene to watch the ship gracefully carrying Poole.
Yes, almost gingerly. Yeah.
Very gingerly. And again, I would almost define this as another waltz-like moment. It almost feels like a dance. Every movement feels very purposeful. As Dave approaches back to the ship to try to enter it, Hal again thwarts him.
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
Dave needs to make a decision about what he is going to do next. And the decision that he needs to make is that he must let Frank go in order to re-enter the ship. And his re-entry to the ship is another moment in this film where your breath is completely taken away. You are on the edge of your seat. It was. So he, in order to re-enter the ship, Hal will not let him in. And so he has to go into space without a helmet for a very short period of time.
Hal thinks he's got him. He thinks he's done. He just says there's no point in having any more conversation. And because Dave was trying to talk his way into the ship.
Yes.
And Hal's like, nah, we don't have anything else to talk about. And then he didn't answer. And Bowman just goes, okay. Now they had teased explosive bolts multiple times in this movie where you see this thing called explosive bolts, and those are real things. They had them on the Mercury capsules, so you could blow the hatch to get out of it, and you would hit something, and the bolts would actually explode, and the hatch would explode outward. Gus Grissom had that happen to him, to his eternal regret, because they blew too fast. His ship filled up with water and sunk. And, he caught all kinds of hell for that, being the second. It's always bad being the second person that's a pioneer.
It is.
But anyway, that was his curse, being the second one. But anyway, so they've been teasing explosive bolts. You'd seen them, and now we get to see them in use, because Bowman uses the Waldo to manually open the door. And because there would have been backups to those kinds of things, and that was something Hal couldn't stop him from doing. And yes, he has no helmet, so he has to blow the bolts and endure vacuum for a period of time. Now, there are people that will say, oh, that's bullshit, that's not possible. Actually, it turns out that you can live for a very short period of time in the vacuum of space and survive it. It's not an instant kill kind of thing that a lot of people think it is.
I've heard something like 30 seconds.
Yeah, maybe something like that. It's a fun thing after you've seen this movie a bunch of times and you have nothing better to do. When he does it, just hold your breath if you could survive. Now, he wouldn't be able to hold his breath because there's vacuum. All of the air in his lungs would so blow all your air out of your lungs and hold your breath and see if you can do what Bowman did. But gets inside the ship, closes the hatch, pressurizes it, and then he's off to the races. And Hal knows that he is pure and totally fucked.
I believe that the book explains this a little bit more. Perhaps you can fill in some of the gaps here, but I believe that Hal empties the oxygen from the ship.
Right. And he's going to kill Hunter and the rest of those guys too. Because he's going to do the mission's too dangerous for humans. So now all of a sudden his problem-solving process is he's going to kill all the humans and just do it his damn self.
Yeah.
And so yeah, he's going to kill all of them. But he sees Dave now fully protected with helmet and everything. The tables are turned. Hal is pleading with him.
Take a stress pill and think things over.
Hey, what are you doing? Hey, we can work this out. I haven't been feeling myself, but I'm better now. And Dave doesn't speak a fucking word to him because he's given him back what Hal gave him when he had the upper hand. And there's no point in talking because Hal is obviously deranged. It's like any other deranged person. They may talk themselves out of something, but then they're going to get right back into trouble again. I mean, we've all had that experience.
Yes.
And then, the most emotionally wrenching part of the film is now getting ready to happen, which is taking down Hal's cortex, his frontal cortex, in the coolest way possible. And they must have been trained on this because he didn't have to pull out a manual. He just knew how to do it.
Yeah.
He goes into Hal's brain, and as he turns these stylus, the modules push out. Now, apparently Kubrick just had some guy behind there just pushing him out with his finger, but it looked so cool.
It does.
It's so perfect. That's just that sort of perfect, again, linear motion. It looks so smooth. And as he takes out each module, Hal's brain becomes less and less functional.
Don't take out my British charm unit. Without that, I'm nothing but a boorish American Clyde. Yeah? Thanks a lot, asswipe. I could have kicked your butt from here to Albuquerque, you fat slime.
And then, then he gets back to his birth. Another birth. Oh, I didn't think about that.
That's true.
Dr.
So
Chandra.
Hal becomes quite childlike, and as Hal is fading away, Hal begins to sing "A Bicycle Built for Two."
Right.
Daisy, Daisy, give me your answer, do.
You had reminded me where that came from, why they chose that.
That's because it was the first song that a computer ever sang.
Bell Labs vocoder, and they had this artificial speech generator singing "A Bicycle Built for Two." Now, did you know that the Italian version of this film, he does not sing that, and nor does he in the German version, and there's another one. He sings the French version. He sings a different sort of nursery type rhyme because it would resonate with French speakers more than Daisy would.
That makes a lot of sense. This scene it's tragic. There's just no words to describe it other than that. This is a moment in this film where I don't know how to feel because I'm feeling so much. I'm overwhelmed with emotion by this scene.
Well, it's the only time that that Dave speaks to him again. He said, "Would you like to hear my song?" And he's like, "Yes, I'd like to hear it." Like you would say to a child that you were trying to chill him out. Does it to me every time.
Even thinking about it, I think that you described last time that we were talking about this, that you get goosebumps, chills just thinking about it, and I very much feel like that with this scene.
Yeah, it's almost traumatic. After Hal is completely turned off, then there is a debriefing video. It says this is what's going on, and that's the exposition.
Yes, it has been pre-recorded by Dr. Haywood Floyd.
Right. Saying this is what the mission is. And then you realize that Hal knew this all along, but they didn't. And they didn't, so you get an inkling of why. In the movie 2010, they talked about it. If it was Dr. Chandra, Bob Balaban, or Balaban, however you pronounce his name, He said, yeah, you lied to it. They tried to explain it, but they didn't really give a very nuanced explanation. But, Dave understands what the real issue is. And then we basically, the next thing that happens in the film is you see Jupiter and its moons line up, and it's in prime numbers, 2 and 3, the first 2 prime numbers. And there's a space between the 2 moons and then the 2 moons and Jupiter. And you see this monolith, and when it perfectly lines up and divides the 2 and the 3, because the monolith was, in perfect dimensions of 1 or 2, 3, and 2, 3, and 7 or something. I can't remember. It was perfect measurements down to the nanometer. But when it bisects those 2 groups of celestial objects, then the Stargate opens, and Dave starts being translated through space through this thing, and sees, we get this really overly long special effects sequence that was done with not digital effects at all.
Yes.
They used
Very
weird.
trippy. I think they used a lot of dripping water drips into different things, and it
Yeah.
is a wild sequence and vastly different than the entire rest of the film.
Correct.
Again, this is when you would want to be really at the height of your trip, would be
Well, yeah.
ideally.
If you did those things, I'm not,
Yeah, if you did those
we're not
things.
recommending it, but if you did,
No,
then
never.
this would be the time. But yeah, and they use this thing called I think it was a scanogram. Is that right? Is that made the things that seemed like they were coming from
Yes, I think that you're
plane.
correct. And yeah, so it feels like you are flying through this vortex. This leads us to Dave. So this is actually something that I do want to note about this is this was the biggest of the monoliths that we saw. I think that that's interesting because is the monolith growing along with humanity is kind of the feeling that I was getting from that.
Oh, that's interesting. Slit scan is
yeah.
what it's called, not scanogram.
I don't think that it necessarily works that way because we do get to see a 4th monolith, which is smaller than this one.
That's true. That's
I
actually
think
the
that
smallest one that we saw. Maybe it's the same size as the one that the hominids had. I never thought about
yeah.
that.
Yeah,
But it's
I think
room
it looks
size.
similar in size. Yeah, it looks
Yeah.
so this brings us into Dave in a room
Mm.
that very much to me feels like an observation room where aliens can observe him and observe his death and then his rebirth. It's almost zoo-like.
Yeah, it's very sterile yet very ornate. Like, hey, we're gonna make something nice for this guy, but you don't really know exactly what that is. But you're
It's
pretty
back to
good.
that imitation. Perhaps,
Right.
with Hal maybe imitating pride, this is imitating, it's creating the shell of a room, a hollow room
Yeah.
where cereal boxes are filled with blue jelly. Or I think I've heard also that the books that are seen also don't have pages in
That's
them.
right. That's right.
We've created this what feels familiar but is not correct sort of a
Right.
room.
Sort of a simulacrum of a room. But
Yes.
they got those ideas from the information that the Stargate sent them. Now, in the 3 million years, or however long it was, between the time that they set the monolith down and Bowman finally comes, they're like, hey, this experiment worked. These beings have gone from being made of matter to transforming themselves into pure energy, which is the sort of, if you think about it, in so much science fiction, that's the pinnacle, is just becoming pure energy. Babylon 5 did that, or was it Babylon?
Yep.
Yes, Babylon 5. Those people, humans 4 million years in the future converted themselves into pure energy. By the way, the end of the 4th season is the end of that show. Everything else has that shit. But anyway, but yeah, so they've transformed themselves into pure energy. And what I love to think about this scene is, Bowman is just standing there in his spacesuit, and then he hears there's somebody in there, and he looks and he sees that it's himself, and that person turns like, what, did I hear something? And there's nobody there. So he's no longer there as the spacesuit Dave. He's now this Dave. Now, I think they had such a weird ability to manipulate time that it happens the way we see it in the film, in that it, he's this age, then he's 20 years older, then he's 20 years older, and then he's 20 years older, and then he dies. But I think also maybe he lived there the whole time in a linear fashion as well. I don't know.
It's definitely very hard to understand. I think that a lot of people struggle with the ending of this film. For me, I have to take it literally. I have to see, I'm seeing the things and I don't necessarily want to interpret it much more. I think it was Ebert who said something along the lines of audiences don't like simple answers.
Yeah.
And, implying that obviously we want the monolith to stand for something, but also.
Oh, if he just spelled it out, it would have sucked so bad.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And so I think that a lot of that confusion, especially with is the timeline linear or not,
right,
is left intentionally confusing. It wouldn't be interesting if it wasn't.
Correct. I agree. I think that he could have done both things is sort of an interesting thing to think about. But now he's on his deathbed.
Yes.
And he, he's dying and you just see that. And then he looks up and it's like, it's like, hello, old friend. From a human standpoint, for humans to see the monolith standing there, even though he's just one human, but, representing all humans, it's like this thing started our journey and now it's going to end it, really, because beyond this, there's nothing else that needs to be done. And, it's just standing there again, completely silent at the foot of his bed. And then Kubrick just tracks into it till it's just a natural white to a black screen. And then we see Bowman fully transformed as the Star Child. Now in the book, he could have been anything he wanted to. He was pure energy. He took the shape of the child because that's how he saw himself compared to his mentors and the rest of the universe. He saw himself as a child. He wasn't ready to take on another form. So yeah, it's pretty neat.
I love the imagery of that small child. This movie started out with primitive life, and it is now ending with new life.
Yeah.
It's almost a point where we no longer need technology. We're literally back to our roots. We're back to the beginning. And now we begin the cycle again, perhaps. Where will the monolith appear the next time? What is in the future? And we don't get answers to any of those questions, of course, because we don't have answers to any of those questions.
Right. And he didn't need the Stargate anymore either.
Yes.
In the book, it just said, the ancient mechanism of the Stargate had, done its job well. It had been sitting there for millions of years waiting for us, but he didn't need it anymore. He just came back. It was pretty cool.
That's actually really cool.
Yeah, it is pretty cool. I'm just going to reiterate, I highly recommend if someone wants a deeper sort of understanding of what Kubrick and Clarke were trying to get at, that you see the book as a companion piece to the movie. They really go together. They wrote them together. They were intended to be enjoyed together. And Clarke had some different ideas, and he had veto power for the book. And Kubrick had ideas, and he had veto power for the film. And so they are distinct, but they're complementary.
I think that's great advice. I think that no matter how people feel about this film, no matter if they absolutely love it or if they absolutely hate it, it is arguably one of the most influential movies of all time. I don't think anybody can argue that. And it has been such an honor for me to get to be able to talk about it with you, because getting to talk about it with somebody who truly loves it and who has such a deep understanding of it in the way that you do, it's an absolute pleasure. And I feel very lucky.
I'm a huge nerd fan. I really appreciate the opportunity to vomit out all this stuff about this movie. Thank you. Because this is for 54 years, I've been wanting to talk to somebody about this movie who cares about it as much as I do, and just let me just ramble about
This has been my absolute honor. I don't know that I ever took the opportunity to think about this movie as much as I did, knowing that I was going to be talking about it with you. It's one of those films that kind of, it exists in my head. I have, I know the humanoid part, I have the star child, I have Dave with the reflections on his eyes. Those are images that live in my head, but I always have liked the idea of it being sort of open-ended. And so I never spent the time to kind of analyze it, think about all of that and why all of these things are happening. So this has been a complete pleasure for me to be able to actually think about it.
Well, likewise, you know, as I said, I've been wanting to talk about this movie for decades, and we got to do it twice, which was even more of a treat for me. And but I learned some things from you. So you can always learn things from people if you open up your mind, and the whole idea of the birth and some of the other concepts that you came up with on on your own, watching this film and reading about it and thinking about it. It just shows there's always more depths that you can plumb. So when next time I watch this, and I will watch it again pretty soon, I will be thinking about you and those ideas and just seeing how they fit into this sort of narrative that's in my head. So I look forward to that. So thank you.
Well, will you tell everybody again a little bit about what you do and where they can find you?
Just Google Weird Medicine. You find me somewhere in there. I have a Patreon. I'm doing some live streams. I'll tell you what, the one thing that I'm really excited about that I'm doing right now is my work with Normal World. So Dave Landau's Normal World, it's on YouTube. They also are on network, but just watch it on YouTube. And I'm doing Ask Dr. Steve segments. They're about 2 to 3 minute segments about gross medical stuff. And I did, my first one was The Worst Way to Die. And another spoiler alert, it was Fournier gangrene. And please don't Google image that. It's just my advice.
I made the mistake of Google imaging it after I watched your episode.
I tell everyone not to Google image it. And, but then of course I spell it so that they can more easily Google image it. But it is really horrendous. But that was fun. And they've let me do some acting. And I got to be a cult leader on a recent
Yes, I just saw that.
So it was fun.
You would make a wonderful cult leader. I would follow you into oblivion. So
thank you. I was chewing the scenery quite a bit, but that was what they wanted. So it's fun.
Thank you again so very much. And thank you guys all for watching.
Thank you.